When you're standing in a rehearsal room or a gig space, the last thing you want is a sax that feels like a compromise. I've spent a lot of time listening to the same instrument in different settings, reading forums where players argue about tone versus price, and watching a few dozen videos of people unboxing and playing the BetterSax Session Alto. The big question that keeps coming up is, does the price tag actually translate into something you notice when you're blowing, or are you just buying a glossy finish? In the next few minutes, I'll walk through what I've learned about this particular model, so you can decide if it's a real upgrade for you or just a pretty piece of metal. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First, let's talk about the kind of player who ends up looking at a handcrafted, matte black alto. Most of the chatter I've seen revolves around two groups: advancing students who have outgrown their beginner sax and are ready for something that can keep up with more demanding repertoire, and semi-professional gig musicians who need an instrument that projects in a live mix without relying on a mic. If you fall into either of those buckets, the Session Alto is worth a closer look. If you're still in the early stages of learning, or you only play a few times a month for fun, the extra cost may not be justified. One of the first things I noticed when I actually set the instrument up was the ergonomics. BetterSax has taken the standard key layout and tweaked the angle of the left-hand side to reduce strain during long passages. In practice, that means when you're running through a 12-measure phrase that sits low on the instrument, your wrist doesn't have to bend as sharply as it would on a typical student model. I tried it out during a 3-hour rehearsal with a big band, and by the end of the set my left hand felt noticeably less fatigued than it usually does with my old intermediate sax. That's a concrete benefit if you regularly play extended gigs or practice for long stretches. Tone and projection are the two words that get tossed around most when people talk about professional saxophones. The Session Alto advertises a superior sound, and the hand-finished mouthpiece that comes with it is meant to complement that claim. In a small rehearsal room, the instrument cut through the mix with a clear, centered voice that didn't need any EQ tweaks. When I moved to a larger venue, a jazz club with a modest stage setup, the sax still held its own without a pickup. The low register was warm and rounded, while the altissimo rang out with a focused edge that didn't sound thin. Those are the moments where the enhanced projection you read about actually matters. You can walk onto a stage, play a melody, and trust that the audience will hear you without having to lean into a microphone. That said, there are a couple of practical trade-offs that aren't obvious from the marketing copy. The matte black finish is striking, but it also shows fingerprints and oil more readily than a traditional lacquered alto. After a few weeks of regular use, you'll find a thin sheen of grime on the bell and body unless you wipe it down after each session. It's not a deal breaker, but it does add a tiny maintenance step that you wouldn't have to think about with a standard silver-toned instrument. Another point to consider is the weight. Because the body is handcrafted from high-grade brass and the case is built to be premium, the sax feels a touch heavier than a typical student model. If you're on the fence because you have a small frame or you need to travel light, give that a moment's thought. Now let's break down the value proposition. The package includes a hand-finished mouthpiece that is already matched to the instrument's bore and tone design. In many cases, players end up buying a separate mouthpiece later to get the sound they want, which can add $100, $200 to the total cost. With the Session Alto, you get a mouthpiece that sits well right out of the box, meaning you can start playing serious repertoire without that extra expense. The case that comes with it is also a step up from the padded gig bags you see with entry-level saxes. It has a molded interior and a solid outer shell, so you can ship the instrument to a gig or store it for months without worrying about dents. Those two accessories together shave off a few $100s that you'd otherwise spend elsewhere. If you're a student who has already maxed out a beginner model and is looking for a bridge instrument, the Session Alto gives you a taste of professional-level response without the steep learning curve that comes with a high-end boutique sax. You'll notice that the key action is smoother, the intonation is more stable across registers, and the instrument's projection reduces the need for aggressive breath support. That can be a confidence booster during auditions or recitals.